Have you ever loved someone so deeply that even the silence between your names became poetry? Welcome to timeless love stories that live beyond the ages, where passion defies reason and longing becomes a prayer whispered into the desert wind. Tonight, we turn the sands of time back to the 7th century, where ancient Persia and the Arabian frontier met under the hush of crescent moons and jasmine-scented nights. In this land of tents and tribal honour, where the written word was worshipped and love was bound by lineage, a boy named Kays and a girl named Laila would begin a story so profound that their names would echo across centuries. This is not just a tale of lovers, it is the lament of souls who burned with a flame so sacred, even death could not extinguish it. It began in the city of Najd, nestled between the shifting dunes and the shadowed groves of date palms. There, the Banu Amir tribe lived a noble people proud of their traditions, where every word spoken carried the weight of history, and every union had to pass through the eyes of elders and the approval of bloodlines. Kays ibn al-Malawa, the only son of a respected sheikh, was known as the moon among stars in the gatherings of poets. He was quiet, thoughtful, and unusually delicate in a world of horsemen and warriors. Yet when he spoke, his words curled like incense, soft, fragrant, unforgettable. Even as a child, Kays seemed touched by something deeper than this world. And Laila, Laila, daughter of the same tribe, but a different fate. Her family, though equal in blood, lived with stricter rules, a firmer grip on honour. She had hair like spilled ink over olive skin, and eyes so dark they seemed carved from the night sky itself. From a young age, she carried a presence graceful, silent, but impossibly radiant. They first met in the school of the village, under the fig tree where the children studied the sacred letters. Kays sat with his inkpot and parchment, but it was her presence beside him that wrote poetry into his soul. One afternoon, their fingers brushed as they reached for the same reed pen, and something ancient stirred. It was not the bold love of adulthood, nor the reckless fire of desire. It was a silent blooming, a vine that wrapped itself around their hearts without permission. No words passed, yet Kays began to write, not verses of war, nor praise of kings, but of her. Laila, the desert holds no thirst like the one your eyes gave me. He wrote it in secret, on parchment he hid beneath his robes. In the beginning, they exchanged only glances, in the classroom, during the festivals, through thin veils and chance shadows. But the heart is not a careful thing. Love, when it is true, does not ask for permission, it only grows. And so word spread. They whispered in the market, the boy Kays is not right. He speaks her name in poems. He walks the streets reciting verses to the wind. Layla's co-father heard them. Her uncles shook their heads. They called it shameful, unmanly, this devotion without structure, without intention. No dowry had been offered, no elders had spoken, and worse, it was public. For in their world, love was not a flower you watered in daylight. It was hidden, arranged, approved. Kays' father warned him, you bring dishonour to our name. But Kays could not stop. He wrote on rocks. He etched her name into the bark of trees. He wandered the outskirts of the camp, muttering her name like a sacred chant. Laila is the breath before dawn. Laila is the wound that sings. His love was becoming a madness. And Laila, though trapped behind curtains and guarded walls, heard. Sometimes, at night, she would press her ear to the wind and listen. Some said she cried when she heard his voice in the distance. Others swore they saw her pacing her courtyard, lips moving without sound. But what could she do? She was a daughter, and daughters did not choose. One evening during the moon festival, the tribe gathered in celebration. Kays was there silent, distant. Laila arrived veiled, surrounded by her aunts. Their eyes met. Just a second. A blink. But in that one glance, 1,000 poems were born. A soft wind passed through the tents, the fire crackled louder. And in the hush that followed, Kay stood and recited a verse before the entire gathering. If you had seen her eyes tonight, you would know why the stars follow her shadow. Silence, then murmurs, then outrage. That night, Laila was locked in her tent, and Kays was no longer just a lover. He became Majnun the madman. What happens to a soul when love is denied not just by fate, but by law, by blood, by fear? The desert, ever a mirror of the heart, began to change its tone. Where once it had offered warm breezes and open paths, now it seemed harsher, its winds sharper, its sands less forgiving. In the days that followed the moon festival, Kays no longer returned home. He wandered. The grove where they had once studied became his sanctuary. His clothes grew dusty, his eyes hollow, yet within him something luminous remained untouched by hunger, unswayed by ridicule. They called him Majnun, possessed, mad one, but madness is a word created by those who fear what they cannot contain. And what could they do with Kays? He no longer obeyed rules. He no longer spoke of anything but Laila. He recited her name at dawn, at dusk, under the stars and to the moon. She is the ink in my blood, the flame in my breath. Without her, I am merely dust learning to walk. His father wept, ashamed yet helpless. His tribe pleaded, forget her. We will find you another. But how can you replace a soul that fits yours like a final puzzle piece in the shape of silence? Laila, meanwhile, was kept indoors. Behind the embroidered curtains, she wilted like a rose pressed between pages no one would read. Her hands no longer played the oud. Her laughter no longer echoed in the courtyard. When her cousins brought her streers, he sleeps in the wilderness now, he speaks to animals, he fasts for days. Her heart did not break, it bent like a reed under the weight of longing. And yet, she never spoke his name aloud again, for a woman's voice, in their world, could cost her everything. But silence, too, can be a language, and in the way her gaze lingered on the horizon at dusk, in the prayers she whispered before sleep, in the tear she hid beneath her veil, he lived. One evening, a suitor came. He was from a powerful family. His name was Ibn Salam, a warrior of wealth and nobility. He sought Laila's hand and came with 10 camels, 20 bolts of silk, and the blessing of her father. She was called to the centre of the tent. Her mother held her by the shoulders. Her father's voice trembled not with softness, but command. This match will honour you. He is strong, he will protect you, and you will forget that boy. But Laila said nothing, and sometimes silence is the bravest no. Still, the elders decided. A wedding date was set. News reached Majnun like a falcon's talon in his chest. They found him pacing under the stars, barefoot, eyes wide. He had not eaten for 3 days. When they told him Laila is to be wed, he collapsed. Yet even in his fall, he whispered, "She is not gone. She is only further than the eye can reach, but my soul still sees her." That night, He walked into the desert, no water, no destination. Some said he sought God, others said he sought death, but Majnun sought only the silence where her name echoed uninterrupted. And in the dunes, the beasts became his friends, the jackals did not harm him, the owls perched beside him, the stars blinked lower to hear his verses. Laila is the wind that forgets to pass, the sun that lingers before dawn. He grew gaunt, almost ghost-like, but his poetry bloomed. It bloomed in the form of verses left on stones, scratched into bark, carved into the bones of memory. Travellers began to repeat his lines, even strangers wept when they heard him. Majnun became legend before death could claim him. And Laila, on the eve of her wedding, she stood in silence. The tent was lit with oil lamps. The women sang. The perfume of rosewater filled the air. But she sat still, as if carved from longing. When her veil was lifted, her eyes were dry but lifeless. Her soul had already left. And when the groom approached her, she turned away. No words, no explanation, just absence. They say she fainted that night, that the marriage was never truly consummated, that Ibn Salam, though victorious in name, could never touch the part of her heart that belonged to a madman in the desert. For how can you hold a woman whose every breath is still writing letters to a ghost? Is it truly madness to love someone so deeply that even God becomes a witness to your longing? Or is it madness to live without such love at all? Majnun wandered. Through the sands that scorched his feet and the valleys that swallowed his voice, he roamed like a prophet without a scripture, only verses, only her name, whispered between breaths. The world had cast him out, and in return he embraced the wilderness. He spoke not to men, but to the stones. He sang not for ears, but for the wind and the animals, the deer, the desert foxes, the circling hawks. They came to know him. They say the wolves laid at his side, that gazelles, startled by all others, rested near him as if lulled by the scent of sorrow. Even the trees bent toward him as if to listen. Laila, he would murmur into the air, if the stars forget your name, I will teach them again, even if my throat must bleed it into the sky. And in the village, the whispers never ceased. Children dared one another to venture where Majnun slept. Poets from far towns came to hear his verses. He had become a myth alive, but barely. One day, a merchant from Yemen passed through Najd. He had heard of the mad poet, and by some twist of fate, found Majnun beneath the curve of a solitary hill, murmuring to the sky. Moved by the sight, the merchant offered him dates, water, a cloak. But Majnun refused all. Instead, he asked, "Do you carry ink? Do you carry parchment?" The man nodded. And so, with fingers trembling from sun and memory, Majnun wrote, "Tell her," he said, "that I have not touched sleep since her name became the dawn in my eyes, that I no longer dream because waking is a dream with her missing from it." The merchant bowed. He carried the letter like a holy relic, crossed sands and trade routes, until it reached the home of Laila. When she received it, she wept not for the words but for the handwriting. She pressed her lips to the page, then hid it beneath her pillow. That night, she refused to eat. She stared at the moon as if trying to draw him down from its light. And the next morning, with a courage stitched together by grief and memory, she sent a reply. Her servant delivered it beneath silence and veil. and within it were only a few lines. "My beloved Majnun, you are not mad, only the world is deaf to the truth. I hear you still. I carry your name like prayer beads inside me. I am a prisoner of walls, but my soul walks barefoot beside you." When the Yesa reached Majnun, he did not smile. He simply closed his eyes and breathed. And for one moment, the desert felt like spring. But not all stories are softened by love returned. Time, relentless as it is, carried Laila further away. Her father, troubled by the rumours, ashamed by her refusal of her husband, fearing dishonour, moved her far from Najd, deep into another province. There, among distant dunes and strangers' voices, she was caged in golden threads. She no longer sang, she no longer wrote. Her face, once the lantern of every gathering, now dimmed behind veils and sighs. And though Ibn Salam still called her wife, he never touched her again. She was present but absent, alive but untouchable. And Majnun? He aged, slowly. His beard grew like wild roots, and his limbs like twisted branches, yet his voice remained clear, his poems sharper than ever. "They call me mad because I speak your name, but if they loved even once, they would know madness is the only sanity left when you are gone." It was then that one of his poems reached the court of a great ruler, a caliph who cherished the arts. Struck by the beauty of the verse, the caliph summoned Majnun to his palace. Guards were sent. They searched the desert until they found the gaunt figure beneath a dry tree, reciting into the dust. He did not resist. He simply said, "I will go if I may speak her name once in your halls." And so, Majnun stood before silks and gold, in a palace where fountains whispered. He was given food, a robe, and an audience. But when asked to recite, he said nothing at first. Then, in a voice low and steady, he began, "Your throne may rest on emerald and flame, but I sit on a stone with her memory as my crown. And in that kingdom I am richer than all of you." The caliph, moved beyond words, asked him what would heal you. And Majnun, with tear-worn eyes, answered simply to sit beside her shadow, even if it never speaks again. But shadows, too, are taken by time, and soon even that wish would prove too far. How long can love survive in silence before it becomes something more, something divine, untouchable, immortal? The years, like sand in the wind, wore on. And Laila, now a woman cloaked in longing, became a ghost within her own life. Her face no longer turned to light. Her eyes, once so full of stars, held only dusk. In the village where she now lived, few dared speak to her. She was called wife, but walked like widow. Her husband, Ibn Salam, though proud and powerful, had long abandoned any hope of warming her heart. He'd come to understand what he could never touch. Sometimes he found her in the courtyard, whispering into her hands, as though holding something fragile. Once, he heard her murmur, "Forgive me, Majnun. The world keeps me, but it cannot keep my soul." And in those moments, he felt not anger, but a strange sorrow. For what man could compete with a love so pure it no longer needed presents to burn? Meanwhile, Majnun lived among ruins. He no longer sought the caliph's favour. He declined gifts, turned from invitations, refused even bread unless it came from a stranger's kindness. His poetry had spread across tribes and cities. Scholars wrote down his verses as if they were scripture, and yet he remained a wanderer, not for fame, not for recognition, but because every breath was still chasing a name. "They say I am alone," he once wrote. "They do not hear her footsteps in my ribs." One spring, after a season of drought, a caravan passed through the valley where Majnun had taken refuge beneath a thorn tree. Among them was an old friend of Layla's family, and when he saw the poet thin, hollow-eyed, with robes like tattered prayer flags, he paused. "I bring news," the man said. Majnun did not ask what kind. He only closed his eyes, as though preparing for a wound already known. The old man hesitated, then whispered, "She is sick," gravely. "The physicians cannot explain it. They say her body fades, though no illness can be found." Majnun nodded, as if death was a chapter he'd already read. That night, he wandered into the hills, alone. No words, no poetry, just the sound of his feet against stone. Some say he fasted until the stars grew dim. Others claim he spoke to the moon, asking it to carry his final breath to her. But none know what happened in those lonely hours, only this. Days later, Layla passed away. She died in her sleep, her hand clutching a page, one of Majnun's poems, faded from time, smudged with tears. Her last breath, the servant swore, was a whisper, "Tell him, I am coming." The news travelled fast, across sands and silence. When it reached Majnun, he did not wail, he did not fall, he simply walked. No one knows how he found the place. Her burial had been quiet, hidden from curious eyes, but he found it beneath a lone palm tree, where the earth was still soft with sorrow. He sat beside her grave, spoke not a word, and after a single night, he too was gone. They found him in the morning, his head resting near the stone that bore her name, his lips still parted, as if speaking to the dust, his fingers curled like vines reaching for roots. And there, in that quiet place, they buried him beside her. 2 graves, 1 shadow. And ever since, the wind that moves across that valley is said to whisper 2 names over and over, Laila, Majnun. Some say they were lovers, some say saints, others say they were mad. But those who have loved, truly loved, know this, they were free. If love can outlive the body, does it not become something sacred like prayer or breath, or the silence between heartbeats? In the years that followed their deaths, no season passed without someone speaking their names. Wanderers, mystics, lovers, they came in silence to the graves. Some left roses, others left verses, but many simply sat beneath the palm tree, letting the wind speak for them. The elders, once so stern, began to soften. Time has a way of erasing pride and polishing sorrow into wisdom. They no longer called Majnun mad. They no longer hid Layla's name in whispers. Instead, they told their children, this is where the stars listened to a broken heart. This is where longing became a kind of light. Poets wrote epics about them. Musicians turned their sorrow into melodies that floated through markets and tents. And scholars, even centuries later, would debate the meanings of Majnun's final lines. She is not gone. She has only stepped into the place where love no longer hides its face. But perhaps the most beautiful tribute came not from words, but from something unseen. One night, a woman, a traveller from the far north, arrived at the site of their resting place. She'd heard the stories, but she did not believe in tales. She believed in things she could touch, hold, measure. And yet, when she sat beside the twin graves, under the moon's gentle eye, something strange happened. She wept, without knowing why. Why? No memory to cause it, no wound in her chest, only a soft, aching swell that came from somewhere deeper than the bones. She left the next morning with nothing in her hands, but something had shifted in her silence. That is what Laila and Majnun had become, not merely a story, but a feeling, a mirror. A reminder that love, when true, does not need victory. It does not require wedding songs or shared roofs or golden rings. Sometimes it is simply this, the soul's recognition of itself in another, even if it must remain apart, even if it must burn. And so, through centuries, their tale passed on. In Persia, storytellers recited it by candlelight, their voices trembling with reverence. In Arabia, children grew up with their names tucked into lullabies, even in distant lands, where deserts were only pictures in books. Hearts stirred when their tale was told. Because the truth is, we all carry a piece of Majnun. We have all stood at the edge of surrender, whispering a name that might never return. We have all, at least once, loved someone who could never be ours. But we loved them anyway. And in that silent act, we understood what it meant to be alive. "Love me," he once wrote, "not with your hand or your name, but with your breath, with your silence, with the ache that grows even when I'm gone." They say the wind still hums his verses across the dunes. They say the earth beneath their graves is softer than any other place in the valley, and that when the moon is full, two shadows sometimes appear, not walking, not standing, but simply leaning toward each other. Forever close, forever apart. Is it possible that the purest love is the one that remains untouched, unfulfilled, yet eternal, like a candle that burns but never melts? Long after their deaths, their story lived on, not in grand monuments or palaces, but in the quiet places, the corners of memory, the edge of every sigh, the hush that falls over lovers when words fail. Majnun and Laila became more than names, they became symbols. In the shadowed alleys of Shiraz, young poets whispered their tale while ink dried on trembling hands. In Baghdad, storytellers recited their verses under starlit tents, where listeners held their breath between each line. In the desert tribes, old men swore they had once seen Majnun barefoot under the moon, walking beside no one and yet looking at someone. Their love, once condemned, was now revered. And why? Because it was not selfish and did not demand. It simply existed like a sacred flame held aloft in a storm, untouched by wind or time. There is a legend that a dervish, a mystic seeker of truth, once came to their graves. He sat for 3 days and 3 nights, not eating, not drinking, only listening. On the 4th night, he spoke aloud, "Show me what it means to love beyond this world." And in the silence that followed, he heard a voice not outside him, but within, a voice that said, "To love as Majnun did is to die before death, to become a mirror in which the beloved sees only themselves, to want nothing but still give everything." The dervish rose with the tears in his eyes. He would later teach that the story of Laila and Majnun was not just about romance, but about divine yearning, about the soul's desire to return to its source. And in this way, their tale became a bridge between body and spirit, between longing and transcendence. Sufis, the mystics of Islam, began to quote Majnun in their gatherings. "When I say Laila, I mean God. When I weep for her, I am weeping for the part of me that remembers eternity." And thus, Majnun's madness was no longer madness, it was devotion. It was a path. A path for those who loved so deeply, so selflessly, that their suffering turned into light. But in the midst of these reverent retellings, the human sorrow of their story remained. Because for all the poetry and spiritual wisdom, they were still two hearts that longed, two souls that were denied, two lives that could not share even a single day beneath the same roof. There is something in that ache that refuses to die. A young bride once left a bouquet at their graves, whispering, "I married him, but I loved another. Forgive me." A traveller from the east carved a single line into the bark of the tree that shaded them. "You were denied love, but gifted eternity." And a child, too young to understand longing, sat beside the tombs and asked her father, why are they sleeping next to each other if they were never allowed to be together? The father smiled, with tears in his eyes, because love is patient, my little one, and the grave cannot close the door that the heart leaves open. Even now, the desert winds that sweep across their final resting place do not howl. They murmur, they hum, they sing. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you might hear the echo of a voice, fragile, tender. Laila. Followed moments later by a second. Majnun. Two names, still calling, still answering, forever. What is left when the body has fallen and the soul has flown? Perhaps only love, that strange fire that burns in the spaces where we are no longer seen, yet still felt. In the quiet aftermath of their passing, life returned to the world that once denied them. Markets opened, children played, songs were sung, time, relentless in its rhythm, moved forward. But beneath it all, something had shifted. A story once seen as scandal was now repeated in reverence. The same elders who once forbade the name Majnun from being spoken in front of their daughters now recited his verses to soothe the hearts of the heartbroken. Mothers who once feared Laila's defiance now prayed that their daughters might one day be loved so purely, and the young who once giggled at tales of madness began to dream not of gold or glory, but of a love that would echo even in their absence. It was said that no wedding in Najd was ever held without at least one verse from Majnun's poetry being recited. I do not wish to possess you, only to breathe where you once stood. His words, no longer fragile, had become pillars strong enough to support generations of longing hearts. But love, true love, does not end in legacy alone. Sometimes leaves imprints deeper than monuments, imprints that only the soul can feel. There is a tale soft as a lullaby whispered in the caravans of the old traders that every 7th spring, when the moon is at its highest and the winds are quiet, two figures appear near the graves. A man in white, his face worn like stone carved by time, and a woman in blue, with hair that falls like dusk over her shoulders. They do not speak, they do not move, they only gaze at each other, as if finishing a conversation that never ended. No one dares disturb them, no one approaches. By dawn they are gone, only petals remain scattered where their shadows might have touched. Some call it superstition, others say it's a trick of moonlight, but the lovers and the poets, they believe. Because they must. Because somewhere within them, they too are waiting. Waiting for someone across time, across silence, across the aching distance that only love dares to cross. Laila and Majnun had no children, no shared home, no photos to frame, no anniversary to mark. But what they had was truth. A truth so radiant, so unshakable, that it softened even the cruelty of the world. Their tragedy did not grow bitter with time. It sweetened, it humbled, it taught that love is not always meant to be held. Sometimes it is meant to be beheld, like a star that you cannot touch, but still guides your path through the dark. So many lovers have walked away from one another, claiming the world was too cruel, the timing too wrong, the rules too rigid. But Laila and Majnun never walked away. They stood still, one under the sun, one under the moon, calling, answering, echoing, until the stars themselves made space for them. "You are not mine," Majnun once wrote, "but I am yours, and that is enough." Enough to carve rivers through stone, enough to light the lamps of longing hearts, enough to live forever. And perhaps that is what makes their love so unforgettable. It asked for nothing, but gave everything. Isn't it strange how the love that breaks us is the very one that makes us whole, that in losing someone, we sometimes find ourselves more clearly. The desert has a memory. It remembers footsteps long vanished. It remembers voices once carried by the wind, and it remembers pain, the kind that does not scream but lingers, soft as dust on stone. It remembered Majnun. Years passed. Seasons came and left with no fanfare. Empires rose and fell. Languages changed. Names were forgotten. But not theirs. Laila and Majnun endured like a scar in the soul of the world, beautiful, aching and sacred. A generation after their passing, a poet named Nizami Ganjavi, a man born far to the north in the land of Shirvan, heard whispers of their tale. He was no stranger to grief. His own beloved had died in childbirth, and since that day his ink had been stained with mourning. But when he heard the story of the boy who lost his name to madness, and the girl who died with that name upon her lips, he felt something stir. He travelled south, through dust and caravan routes, searching for scraps of their truth. He visited ruins, spoke to old storytellers, collected fragments, poems, parables, prayers, and from their sorrow he wove an epic. Laila and Majnun, a tale written not in ink, but in the blood of longing, not in chapters, but in heartbeats, each verse a footstep retracing their path. Through his words, the lovers rose again, not as myth, but as mirror. He gave their pain form, he gave their sunlets voice, and in doing so he gave the world a map to its own aching heart. Majnun did not die of grief, Nizami wrote. He became grief itself, a shadow that outlived its sun. The book spread from Persia to the Ottoman courts, from the Levant to the coasts of Hindustan. It was passed like a sacred flame. Pain recognized pain, love recognized love, and suddenly Laila and Majnun were everywhere. Their names carved into tree trunks by teenage hands, their verses whispered beneath wedding veils, their story performed in song, in silk, in stone. But even as their legend grew, the truth remained untouched beneath it. They had not lived to be remembered. They had not loved for the world. They had loved for each other. And perhaps that is why we still speak their names, because they ask for nothing but the freedom to feel. To feel so deeply, so wildly, so fully that the world itself grew ashamed for denying them. It is said that every true lover becomes at some point a little like Majnun, dishevelled, unreachable, wandering through memories like a traveller who has forgotten their destination, but not the face of the one who first set them on the road. And every true beloved becomes, in her way, a little like Laila caged in duty, bound by silence, carrying the flame of a forbidden name just behind the eyes, where no one dares to look too long. But both endure, because love, once awakened, does not die. It may lie still, may go quiet, but in the right moment, in a song, a line of poetry, a dream, it returns. And when it does not ask, was it real? It only asks, do you still feel it? When love is denied by the world and yet clung to by the soul, does it not become something higher than love, something holy, something that refuses to bow to time, silence, or even death? The desert winds that once carried Majnun's verses now carried his legend. But legends are never static. They shift, they bend, they find new soil in which to grow. And so the story of Laila and Majnun did not remain trapped in the sands of Najd or the ink of Nizami. It crossed oceans, took root in places far from their resting place. In Andalusia, where poets carved verses into arches, lovers recited Majnun's grief beneath the whispering fountains. In Kashmir, his laments were woven into carpets, each knot a verse, each thread a vow. In the markets of Cairo, girls sang Layla's name with henna-stained palms, their voices trembling as if recalling pain not their own. Their tale, like love itself, knew no border. But the story at its core remained unchanged. A boy who loved beyond reason, a girl who bore the weight of that love in silence, and a world too small, too rigid, to allow their hearts to meet in life. Perhaps this is why the tale never faded, because it is not just a story, it is every story. Every child who has looked through a window and longed for someone walking away, every bride who has spoken vows with one name on her lips and another in her soul, every man who has written words no one would read, just to feel close to the one who no longer answers. They're all, in some way, Majnun. They're all, in some Laila. But even as time tried to turn them into archetypes, even as their names were stitched into rugs and sung into oblivion, the human truth of them remained. Laila, the girl with a name like a lullaby, who bore her fate with dignity, who never stopped loving, even as her body grew weaker, even as her voice faded into the walls of a home that was never hers. And Majnun, the boy whose love became his grave and his glory, who let the world call him mad, so long as it meant he could still carry her name like a flame in the darkness. There is a final poem seldom recited said to be found scribbled on a scrap of leather in an abandoned cave. Believers say it was written by Majnun in the final days, when his body was frail and the wind itself had become his only companion. The words were faint, like they had been written with breath. I loved her not as a man loves a woman, but as the earth loves the rain, not to hold but to be changed by it. That is the lesson they left us. That true love does not conquer, it transforms. It does not demand, it gives. It does not promise happiness, it offers meaning. And in that meaning, even sorrow becomes sacred. So tonight, if you find yourself looking toward the stars, if your heart aches for something you cannot name, know that you are not alone. You are standing in the echo of a love that once burned so brightly. It lit the sky from Arabia to the edge of dreams. You are walking in the footsteps of those who dare to feel fully, boldly, without apology. And somewhere, beneath a palm tree lost to time, two souls rest, not in silence, but in the soft murmur of every heart that has ever dared to love beyond what the world permits. And so what do we leave behind, if not the echo of our love, not the stones we built, nor the titles we held, but the tenderness we gave, the names we whispered into the silence of the world? The final chapter of Laila and Majnun's story is not written in books. It is written in pauses, in sighs, in the trembling hush after a love song ends. For theirs was a love that refused to be resolved, a love that did not seek conclusion, only continuation. In the village once called Najd, the earth has changed. The palm tree that once shaded their graves has withered, its bark cracked with age, its roots now feeding the wind. But the land remembers. Travellers still come, even now, centuries later. Some bring flowers, some bring verses, but most bring nothing except the ache in their chest that only this story seems to name. And when they kneel beside the unmarked stones, they do not speak, because the desert does not require language, it requires feeling. There is a tradition that if you stand between the graves with your eyes closed and whisper the name of the one you love most, the wind will carry it to wherever love hides now. Not every whisper will return an answer, but every whisper will be heard. Because that is the legacy of Laila and Majnun, not lovers who failed, but lovers who endured. Who taught the world that even when denied, even when unseen, even when punished, love remains. It hides in verses left behind on crumbling stones, in melodies carried by flutes in the distance, in the soft way a stranger's gaze can feel like home. Majnun once wrote, in the solitude of his final years, "To the world we are gone, but to the soul we are never far, for where love has truly lived, there is no such thing as goodbye." And Laila, silent, veiled, imprisoned, left no final words, only a breath, and in that breath the whole of her devotion. What they could not have in life, they now possess in the folds of every aching heart that dares to believe that love is more than marriage, more than kisses, more than presence. It is longing, it is surrender, it is memory, it is faith. Faith that somewhere, somehow, even if not in this life, our souls will recognize their match and whisper, "I know you, I have waited." So tonight, dear listener, if you find yourself sleepless, heart adrift, eyes fixed on the darkness that hides so many names, know that you are not alone. You are walking through the same desert Majnun once walked, carrying the same fire Laila once kept hidden in her chest. And in that sacred ache you are loved. Truly, wholly, endlessly. Good night.